There is a particular kind of grief that nobody warns you about. It is not the grief of death, not the clean finality of a funeral and a headstone, and the slow march of time that eventually softens the sharpest edges of loss. No, this grief is worse in many ways because the person you are mourning is still alive. They are still breathing, still walking, still existing somewhere in the world, but they have chosen to erase you from their life as completely as if you had never existed at all. My grandfather is 76 years old. He lives in a house I helped him renovate 12 years ago. He remarried 4 years ago to a woman who has systematically dismantled everything our family once was. And as I sit here trying to put into words what happened, trying to explain how the man who taught me to ride a bicycle and build birdhouses and believe in the fundamental goodness of people became a stranger who looks through me like I am made of glass, I realize that this is the story of how love can be weaponized, how loyalty can be exploited, and how the people who are supposed to protect you can become the very ones who destroy everything you hold dear. My grandmother Ellen died 6 years ago, and I think that is where this story truly begins, even though the worst of it came later. She was the heart of our family, the quiet center around which everything else orbited. She was not a dramatic woman, not someone who demanded attention or made grand gestures. She showed her love through actions, through Sunday dinners that brought everyone together, through the garden she tended with almost religious devotion, through the way she remembered every birthday and anniversary and small milestone in the lives of everyone she cared about. When she got sick, it happened fast. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, aggressive, and merciless. She was gone within 4 months of the diagnosis, and in those 4 months, I watched my grandfather transform from a steady, capable man into someone who seemed to have lost the very ability to function. We all rallied around him after she died. My father, David, his eldest son, practically moved into the house for the first few weeks, cooking meals and handling paperwork and sitting with his father through the long, sleepless nights. My sister Sophie visited every day, bringing her daughter Lily, who was only 3 at the time, but whose presence seemed to bring Grandad Arthur brief moments of genuine joy. I came down from Manchester every weekend, sometimes staying for several days, helping with the house, the garden, the endless bureaucratic tasks that follow a death. We were a family united in grief, and we were determined that Grandad would never feel alone, that he would always have us, that the love Ellen had built would survive her even if she could not. For the first 2 years after Gran died, things were hard but manageable. Grandad struggled with depression, which was entirely understandable, and he had good days and bad days like anyone processing profound loss. But he was still himself. He still came to family dinners, still called to check on us, still told the same corny jokes he had been telling for decades. He talked about Ellen constantly, which we encouraged because we wanted him to remember her, wanted to keep her memory alive. He kept her garden going, not with her skill, but with determination, and seeing him out there among her roses and hydrangeas always made my heart ache with a complicated mixture of sadness and love. He was grieving, but he was still our grandfather. He was still Arthur Mitchell, the man who had been the patriarch of our family for as long as any of us could remember. The first time I heard the name Vivian Cross was about 2.5 years after Gran's death. Grandad mentioned casually that he had started attending a social group at the local community center, a bereavement support group that had apparently evolved into a more general gathering for retired people looking for companionship. He said there was a woman there who had lost her husband a few years back, a very nice woman who understood what he was going through, and they had started having coffee together after the meetings. I remember feeling genuinely happy when he told me this. The idea of Grandad finding friendship, finding connection, finding reasons to leave the house and engage with the world again seemed like exactly what he needed. I encouraged him to keep going to the group, to nurture this friendship, to let himself experience joy again without feeling guilty about it. I had no idea what I was encouraging him toward. I met Vivian for the first time about 3 months later when Granddad invited the family to Sunday dinner and mentioned that his friend would be joining us. The woman who walked into Gran's house that afternoon was nothing like what I had expected. Vivian Cross was elegant in a carefully maintained way, with perfectly styled silver blonde hair, expensive clothes that walked the line between sophisticated and flashy, and a smile that seemed designed to charm. She was younger than Granddad by more than a decade, which surprised me, and there was something about her eyes that made me slightly uncomfortable even in that first meeting. They were calculating eyes, I realize now, eyes that were always assessing, always measuring, always looking for advantage. But at the time, I told myself I was being paranoid, being overprotective of my grandfather, being unfair to a woman who was probably perfectly nice and simply nervous about meeting her new friend's family. Vivian was charming that first dinner. She complimented the house, asked interested questions about everyone's lives and jobs and children, and told stories about her own past that painted her as a resilient woman who had overcome hardship. She had been married twice before, she explained, once to a man who died young of a heart attack and once to a man who, she implied with artful vagueness, had been controlling and unkind. She had 2 adult children from her first marriage, a son named Marcus and a daughter named Serena, who lived in London and were very successful in their respective fields. She spoke about them with obvious pride, describing their accomplishments in ways that subtly suggested they were considerably more impressive than anything our family had achieved. I noticed this at the time, but dismissed it as a mother's natural tendency to boast about her children. I noticed many things that day that I dismissed. I was trying so hard to be open-minded, to be welcoming, to support my grandfather's happiness that I refused to see what was already becoming clear. The relationship progressed faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months of that first dinner, Granddad announced that Vivian was going to move into the house. Within a year, he told us they were getting married. The family's reactions were mixed but generally supportive. My father had reservations he kept mostly to himself, expressing only a mild concern about the speed of things and a gentle reminder that Granddad should consider a prenuptial agreement to protect the family assets. Sophie was more openly worried, pulling me aside at one family gathering to whisper that something about Vivian felt off, that she seemed too interested in Granddad's finances, too quick to insert herself into family matters. But we both talked ourselves out of these concerns. Granddad was an adult. He had the right to find happiness again. And who were we to question his judgment about his own life? The wedding was a small ceremony at the local registry office, followed by a reception at a restaurant Vivian had chosen. I remember being struck by how few people from Granddad's life were there compared to how many of Vivian's friends and family attended. Her children, Marcus and Serena, came up from London, and I met them for the first time that day. Marcus was polished and dismissive, shaking my hand with barely concealed disinterest and spending most of the reception checking his phone. Serena was friendlier on the surface, but had the same calculating look in her eyes that her mother did, asking questions about my career and my income and my property in ways that felt more like reconnaissance than genuine interest. Vivian's friends were similar, a collection of well-dressed older women who looked at our family with something that felt uncomfortably close to pity, as if we were obstacles to be managed rather than people to be welcomed. The changes started small, so small that each one in isolation seemed insignificant. Vivian redecorated the living room, replacing Gran's comfortable furniture with pieces that were more modern and, she said, more appropriate for the space. She reorganized the kitchen, moving things Ellen had placed deliberately over decades into new locations that made no sense to any of us. She had the garden redesigned by a professional landscaper, tearing out the roses Ellen had planted when she and Granddad first moved into the house. replacing them with a low-maintenance arrangement of ornamental grasses and stone features that required almost no attention. Each change was presented as practical, as necessary, as an improvement, and each change erased a little more of my grandmother from the home she had built and loved. I confronted Granddad about the garden about 8 months after the wedding. I tried to be gentle, tried to frame it as a question rather than an accusation, but I could not hide how much it hurt to see Ellen's roses gone. Granddad's response was defensive in a way I had never seen from him before. He said Vivian was his wife now, and the house was her home too, and she had every right to make it feel like hers. He said the garden had become too much work for him to maintain, which was true but missed the point entirely. He said I needed to accept that things were different now and stop living in the past. There was something in his voice that did not sound like him, something recited rather than felt, and I left that conversation with a cold feeling in my stomach that I could not shake. The financial changes came next, subtle at first, and then increasingly alarming. Granddad had always been careful with money, a product of growing up in post-war England, where waste was sinful and savings were sacred. He had built a comfortable retirement through decades of steady work and prudent investment, and he had always been clear that his assets would be passed down to his children and grandchildren, a legacy that reflected his values of family and continuity. About a year into the marriage, my father discovered accidentally that Granddad had removed him as the secondary signatory on his main bank account, replacing him with Vivian. When Dad asked about it, Granddad brushed off his concerns, saying it was just practical since Vivian was helping him manage the household finances. When Dad pushed further, suggesting gently that perhaps it was important to maintain some separation, Granddad became angry in a way that was shocking to witness. He accused Dad of not trusting his judgment, of treating him like a senile old man, of being jealous of his happiness. Dad backed off, shaken by the confrontation, and we all tried to convince ourselves that it was just a misunderstanding, that Granddad was still in control, that Vivian was not deliberately isolating him from his family. But the isolation was exactly what was happening, I realize now. It happened so gradually that we did not recognize it as a pattern until it was almost complete. Vivian started scheduling activities on Sundays that conflicted with our family dinners. She encouraged Granddad to spend more time with her friends and her children, who began visiting more frequently from London, always with elaborate plans that excluded us. She made comments about how difficult it must be for Granddad to drive to Manchester to visit me, about how tiring family gatherings were for a man of his age, about how important it was for him to conserve his energy and focus on the people who truly had his best interests at heart. The implication was clear even when she did not state it directly. We were a burden, an obligation, a drain on the limited resources of his remaining years. Her family, by contrast, was presented as a source of joy and vitality, young and successful and exciting compared to our ordinary, demanding, draining presence. Sophie was the first one Vivian targeted directly. My sister has always been emotional, quick to speak her mind and slow to hide her feelings, and Vivian used this against her with devastating precision. About 18 months into the marriage, Sophie confronted Vivian about some of the changes to the house, about the erasure of Gran's memory, about the increasing distance between Granddad and his biological family. The confrontation was heated, and Sophie said some things in anger that she later regretted, though nothing that was untrue. Vivian responded not with argument, but with tears, with wounded dignity, with a performance of victimhood that was so convincing I might have believed it myself if I had not seen the flash of satisfaction in her eyes when Granddad rushed to comfort her. After that incident, Granddad called Sophie and told her she needed to apologize. When Sophie refused, explaining that she had only spoken the truth and that Vivian was the one who should be apologizing, Granddad said something I never thought I would hear him say. He said that if Sophie could not treat his wife with respect, perhaps it would be better if she stayed away for a while. Sophie hung up the phone and sobbed in my arms for an hour. The rift with Sophie established a pattern that Vivian exploited ruthlessly. Any family member who questioned her, who challenged her influence, who threatened her position in Granddad's life, was systematically excluded. My father tried to mediate, tried to maintain a relationship with his father while navigating around Vivian's sensitivities, but it was like walking through a minefield blindfolded. Every conversation was an opportunity for misunderstanding. Every visit was fraught with tension. Every attempt at reconciliation was somehow turned into evidence of our hostility and Vivian's victimhood. Dad started developing health problems during this period, stress-related issues that his doctor attributed to the ongoing family conflict. He was caught between his love for his father and his loyalty to his children, and the strain was visibly aging him. I tried a different approach. I decided to befriend Vivian, to kill her with kindness, to become so accommodating and supportive that she would have no reason to view me as a threat. I invited her and Granddad to my home in Manchester, planned activities I thought she would enjoy, sent her birthday cards and Christmas gifts, made every effort to include her in my life as a genuine family member rather than an intruder. For a while, this seemed to work. Vivian was warmer toward me than she was toward Sophie or my father, and she made comments about how nice it was that at least one of Arthur's grandchildren knew how to be civilized. I felt guilty about this preferential treatment, felt like I was betraying my sister and my father by receiving the approval they were denied. But I told myself it was a strategy, a way to maintain a connection with Granddad that I could eventually use to bring the family back together. What I did not realize was that Vivian was using me too. She was gathering information about the family through our conversations, learning our weaknesses and resentments and conflicts, storing away ammunition for future use. She also used my apparent acceptance of her to further isolate the family members who did not accept her, telling Granddad that even James understood she was not the problem, that it was Sophie and David who were being unreasonable, that my good relationship with her proved the others were at fault. I was being played, and I was too blind to see it. The will was changed about 2.5 years into the marriage. None of us knew about it at the time. Granddad had always been open about his estate planning, discussing it with Dad and assuring us that the house and his savings would be divided fairly among his descendants, with provisions for his grandchildren and great-grandchildren that reflected his love for the generations that would carry on after him. He had shown us the documents years earlier, had explained his reasoning, had made it clear that this was his way of ensuring his legacy extended beyond his own lifetime. So, when he stopped mentioning the will, stopped talking about inheritance and legacy and the future, we assumed nothing had changed. We assumed his silence was simply because the topic was now uncomfortable given Vivian's presence, not because the entire plan had been rewritten. I learned about the change through my cousin Andrew, whose mother was Granddad's younger sister. Andrew worked in legal services and had connections in the local solicitor community. He called me one afternoon with a question that hit me like a physical blow. He asked if I knew that Granddad had transferred the house into joint ownership with Vivian, and whether the family was aware that a new will had been filed that named Vivian as the primary beneficiary of essentially everything. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. He sent me documents he had obtained through channels I did not ask about, and I sat at my kitchen table staring at papers that proved my grandfather had systematically diverted his entire estate away from his biological family and toward his new wife and her children. The house Ellen and Arthur had bought together in 1972, the house where my father and his siblings had grown up, the house filled with 50 years of family history, was now legally half Vivian's, with arrangements ensuring she would inherit Arthur's half upon his death. The savings accounts that had been earmarked for grandchildren's education were empty, the money transferred to new accounts in Vivian's name. The investment portfolio that represented decades of careful planning was now structured in ways that would benefit Vivian's children, Marcus and Serena, upon Granddad's death, with only token amounts designated for his actual descendants. And there was a provision I kept reading over and over because I could not believe it was real. In the event of any legal challenge to the will by Arthur's biological family, their inheritance would be reduced to nothing, ensuring that any attempt to contest the document would result in total disinheritance. I called my father and told him what I had learned. There was a long silence on the phone, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with a grief I had never heard from him before. He said he was not surprised, that he had suspected something like this was coming, that he had tried to talk to Granddad about estate planning several times in the past year and had been shut down each time with increasing hostility. He said he did not care about the money for himself, that he had never expected to inherit anything substantial, but that it broke his heart to think about what this meant for Sophie and me and the next generation. He said it felt like Granddad was not just cutting us out of his estate, but cutting us out of his history, erasing us from the legacy he was leaving behind, declaring through legal documents that we meant nothing to him compared to a woman he had known for less than 4 years. I wanted to confront Granddad immediately, to drive down to his house and demand an explanation, but Dad convinced me to wait. He said we needed to approach this carefully, needed to understand the full picture before making any moves, needed to consider the possibility that Granddad was acting under undue influence and might need our help rather than our anger. We agreed to request a family meeting, to try one more time to have an honest conversation, to give Granddad the opportunity to explain his decisions before we made assumptions about his motivations. Getting a meeting was harder than I expected. Vivian controlled access to Granddad now with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it was not so infuriating. When I called the house, she answered and took messages that Granddad never seemed to receive. When I texted Granddad directly, I got brief responses that did not sound like him, that I later learned were often written by Vivian on his phone. When I showed up unannounced one Saturday afternoon, Vivian met me at the door and told me apologetically that Arthur was resting and could not have visitors. I could see him through the window, sitting in the living room watching television, clearly not resting, but Vivian stood in the doorway with a smile that dared me to make a scene. I left without seeing my grandfather, and I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes trying to understand how we had gotten to this point. The meeting finally happened about a month later, after my father called and practically begged Vivian to allow us 30 minutes with his own father. She agreed with conditions. The meeting would take place at the house, she would be present throughout, and there would be no discussion of finances or legal matters. Dad agreed to everything just to get us in the door. Sophie came too, despite Vivian's obvious displeasure, and the three of us sat in what had been Gran's living room, now redecorated beyond recognition, facing Granddad and Vivian across a coffee table that felt like a barricade. Granddad looked older than he had even a few months before. There was a tiredness in his eyes that went beyond physical fatigue, a kind of resignation that I had never seen in him before. Vivian sat beside him with her hand on his arm, a gesture that might have looked supportive from the outside but felt controlling from where I was sitting. Every time Granddad started to speak, she would squeeze his arm slightly, redirect his attention, guide the conversation back to safe topics. We talked about the weather, about my job, about Sophie's daughter starting school. We talked about nothing that mattered while everything that mattered sat unspoken in the room with us. Finally, I could not stand it anymore. I broke the agreement and asked Granddad directly about the will. I asked why he had changed it without telling us, why he had transferred the house, why he was leaving everything to a woman he had known for less than 4 years while cutting out the family that had loved him for decades. Vivian's expression hardened instantly and she started to speak, but I was not looking at her. I was looking at my grandfather, trying to find the man I knew somewhere behind those tired, guarded eyes. What happened next is burned into my memory with perfect, painful clarity. Granddad looked at me, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face, something like doubt, or sorrow, or regret. But then Vivian's hand tightened on his arm, and his expression closed like a door slamming shut. He told me that his decisions were his own, and none of my business. He told me that Vivian was his wife and his priority, and that the family needed to accept that. He told me that if we could not be happy for his happiness, then perhaps we did not deserve to be part of his life. He said the words as if he had rehearsed them, as if they had been written for him, and I realized with sickening certainty that they probably had been. Sophie started crying, which made Vivian roll her eyes with theatrical exasperation. Dad stood up with the careful dignity of a man trying not to scream and said we should leave. I stayed seated, looking at my grandfather, willing him to show some sign that he understood what he was doing, that he recognized the family he was destroying, that somewhere inside him, the man who had taught me to build birdhouses and told me he loved me at the end of every phone call was still fighting against whatever Vivian had done to him. He would not meet my eyes. He looked at the floor, at his hands, at anywhere but the faces of the grandchildren he was abandoning. And I understood in that moment that we had already lost him, that the man we knew was gone, replaced by someone who wore his face but made decisions he never would have made, who treated his family like strangers and strangers like family. We left without saying goodbye. I was too angry for words, too heartbroken for pleasantries. Sophie was still crying in the car, and Dad drove in silence with his jaw clenched so tight I worried about his blood pressure. Nobody spoke for the entire drive back to Dad's house, and when we arrived, we sat in the living room surrounded by photos of the family we used to have, the family that was now irrevocably broken. The legal battle started 3 months later. It was not our choice initially. Granddad, or rather Vivian, using Granddad's name and money, sent us a solicitor's letter accusing us of harassment, of attempting to interfere with his marriage, of making false accusations about his mental capacity. The letter demanded that we cease all contact with him unless specifically invited and threatened legal action if we continued to, in the letter's words, harass and defame Mrs. Vivian Mitchell and disrupt the peace of Mr. Arthur Mitchell's home. We were being legally forbidden from seeing our own grandfather, and he was apparently the one requesting it. Dad wanted to comply, to back off, to give Granddad space in the hope that he would eventually come to his senses. Sophie wanted to fight, to challenge the will, to have Granddad evaluated for mental capacity, to expose Vivian for the manipulator she was. I was caught between them, understanding both perspectives, seeing the merit and the dangers in each approach. In the end, the decision was made for us. We received notice that Granddad was filing a formal complaint against Sophie for harassment based on phone calls she had made trying to reach him and messages she had sent to his phone. The complaint was clearly designed to establish a legal record that would support the harassment narrative, that would make us look like the aggressors and Granddad and Vivian like the victims. We had to respond, had to defend ourselves, had to engage with a legal system that Vivian had clearly been preparing to weaponize for some time. The months that followed were the worst of my life. The legal fees alone were devastating. I had to remortgage my flat just to keep up with the solicitor's bills. Sophie, already struggling financially as a single mother, was drowning in costs she could not afford. Dad drained his savings trying to fund the fight, trying to protect his children from the consequences of defending themselves against their own father. The emotional cost was even higher. I stopped sleeping properly. I lost weight. I found myself unable to focus at work, unable to maintain relationships, unable to think about anything except the nightmare that had consumed our family. I went to therapy for the first time in my life, sitting in a stranger's office trying to explain how the grandfather who had been my hero was now my adversary in a legal battle that was destroying everything. The court case itself was a circus. Vivian had hired expensive lawyers who painted a picture of a loving wife being persecuted by jealous, money-grubbing relatives who could not accept that Arthur had found happiness after his first wife's death. They produced evidence of Sophie's angry texts taken out of context to look threatening. They produced records of my attempts to visit the house, framed as stalking and intrusion. They produced statements from Vivian's friends and family, testifying to our hostility, to our greed, to our irrational hatred of a woman whose only crime was loving Arthur Mitchell. Our lawyers tried to present evidence of undue influence, of financial manipulation, of the systematic isolation that Vivian had engineered. But the burden of proof for undue influence is high, and we did not have enough. We had suspicions and patterns and obvious motives, but we did not have a recording of Vivian admitting what she was doing, did not have documents proving she had forged signatures, did not have the kind of smoking gun that would convince a court that an adult man was not entitled to make his own decisions about his own estate. Granddad testified at one hearing, the only time during the legal proceedings that I saw him in person. He sat in the witness box looking small and lost, reciting answers that sounded memorized, defending decisions that clearly brought him no joy. The opposing lawyer asked him if he wanted a relationship with his grandchildren, and he said no, his voice flat and hollow. He said we had never really loved him, only his money. He said Vivian was the first person who had ever truly understood him. He said he wished he had never had biological grandchildren at all, that Vivian's children, Marcus and Serena, were more family to him than we had ever been. I sat in the courtroom listening to my grandfather deny our entire shared history, and I felt something inside me break in a way that I knew would never fully heal. We lost the case. The judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence of undue influence, that Arthur Mitchell was of sound mind and had the right to dispose of his assets as he saw fit, and that the family's challenges to his will were without legal merit. The clause disinheriting anyone who contested the will was triggered. We would receive nothing, not the house, not the savings, not even the small bequests that had originally been designated for the grandchildren. Everything would go to Vivian and, upon her death or remarriage, to her children. The judge added a personal note to the ruling, expressing sympathy for what he called a regrettable family situation, but emphasizing that the law could not compel an adult to maintain relationships he did not wish to maintain. We were legally and officially erased from Arthur Mitchell's life and legacy. The aftermath of the ruling was strangely quiet. I expected to feel devastated, and I was, but there was also a numbness that came from having expected this outcome even while fighting against it. Dad was the most affected. He had lost not just a legal case, but his father, his history, his sense of who he was and where he came from. He aged visibly in the months after the ruling, his health declining in ways that worried all of us. Sophie threw herself into work, and her daughter channeling her grief into fierce determination to build a future that did not depend on what we had lost. And I retreated into my own life, trying to construct walls around the hurt, trying to convince myself that I could move forward without resolution. But there was still unfinished business. Evidence that emerged after the trial that could not change the legal outcome, but that at least illuminated what had really happened. About 8 months after the ruling, I received an anonymous letter at my flat. Inside was a USB drive and a short note that said, "You deserve to know the truth. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." The USB drive contained audio recordings, dozens of them, of conversations between Vivian and her children, Marcus and Serena. Someone close to Vivian had been recording for years, capturing discussions that revealed exactly what had been done to my grandfather and why. The recordings were stunning in their casual cruelty. Vivian spoke openly about her strategy for isolating Arthur from his family, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate an old man who was lonely and desperate for companionship. She discussed the financial changes she had orchestrated, celebrating each transfer of assets as a victory in what she called the long game. She mocked my grandfather's attachment to his first wife's memory, describing Ellen as pathetic and laughable and sneering at Arthur's grief as something she had to manage to get what she wanted. Her children were full participants in these conversations, offering suggestions for how to further isolate Arthur, discussing what they would do with their expected inheritance, treating the destruction of our family as entertainment. But the most devastating recording was one where Vivian discussed the will directly. She talked about finding a solicitor who was willing to work with elderly clients in ways that more ethical lawyers would refuse. She talked about ensuring that Arthur never had a moment alone to reconsider, about how she timed his signing of documents for moments when he was tired or confused or medicated. She talked about the drugs she sometimes added to his evening tea, mild sedatives that made him compliant and agreeable. She talked about all of this with the casual tone of someone describing a successful business strategy with no apparent awareness that she was describing crimes. I took the recordings to our solicitor, who listened with growing incredulity. He said this changed everything, that what was described on these recordings constituted fraud, undue influence, and potentially even assault given the drugging. He said we could take this to the police, could potentially have the will overturned, could see Vivian charged with criminal offenses, but he also warned me that the anonymous source complicated matters, that Vivian would claim the recordings were fabricated, that we would have to prove their authenticity in a new legal battle that could take years and cost more money than we had already lost. He asked if I was prepared to go through all of that again. I did not have to decide alone. I played the recordings for Dad and Sophie, watching their faces as they heard Vivian's words, as they understood the full scope of what had been done. Dad cried, not with grief this time, but with a kind of vindication mixed with horror. He had known something was wrong. He had felt it in his bones even when he could not prove it. And now here was proof. Too late to save his relationship with his father, but perhaps not too late for some form of justice. Sophie's reaction was simpler. Pure, focused rage. She wanted Vivian destroyed. She wanted her prosecuted, imprisoned, publicly exposed for the predator she was. She did not care about the money or the house. She cared about making Vivian pay for what she had done to our family. We went to the police. The process was slow and frustrating, as police processes involving complex financial crimes against elderly victims often are. But the recordings were authenticated by experts, traced back to devices that had been in Vivian's household. The investigation expanded as other victims came forward, people who had known Vivian in her previous lives, previous marriages, previous schemes. It turned out that her second husband, the one she had implied was controlling and unkind, had actually been a victim of her financial manipulation too. His family had tried to warn authorities at the time, but had been dismissed as bitter in-laws. Now their testimony was part of a growing body of evidence against Vivian Cross Mitchell. The police moved carefully, building a case that would hold up in court. It took almost 2 years from the time I received that USB drive to the day Vivian was finally arrested. 2 years during which Granddad continued to live with her, continued to be isolated from us, continued to exist in the controlled environment she had created. I do not know if he was aware of the investigation. I do not know if anyone tried to tell him what was coming. I choose to believe that some part of him still wanted to be rescued, that the man I knew was still in there somewhere, waiting for someone to break through the walls Vivian had built around him. The day of Vivian's arrest, I drove to my grandfather's house. The police had executed a warrant earlier that morning, had taken Vivian away in handcuffs while a social worker assessed the situation inside. I arrived to find my grandfather sitting in the living room, surrounded by strangers, looking more confused and lost than I had ever seen him. The house was in disarray from the search. Vivian was gone, and Granddad was looking around as if he was waking up from a long, strange dream and did not recognize where he was. I sat down beside him and took his hand. He looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. Memory. Pain. "James," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. Jamie, I don't understand what's happening. Where is everyone? Where's Ellen? He thought Gran was still alive. The confusion, the possible effects of whatever Vivian had been giving him, the trauma of the past years, it had all muddled his sense of time and reality. I held his hand and told him gently that Ellen had been gone for a while, that we had all missed her very much, that I was here now and everything was going to be okay. He started crying, confused tears that seemed to be for everything and nothing, and I stayed with him until the social worker said they needed to take him to the hospital for evaluation. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of relief and grief. Granddad was diagnosed with early-stage dementia, which Vivian had clearly been exploiting and possibly accelerating with her medications. He was also malnourished and dehydrated, signs of neglect that supported the criminal case against Vivian. He was moved to a care facility where he could receive proper treatment, and we were finally able to visit him regularly, to be part of his life again, to try to rebuild some connection after years of enforced separation. But the grandfather who emerged from Vivian's control was not the same man who had entered it. He was confused about the past several years, mixing up memories, sometimes forgetting entire conversations minutes after they happened. He sometimes asked about Vivian, wondering where she was, why she had not visited, and we had to explain over and over that she was not coming back. He sometimes called me by my father's name, or thought Sophie was her mother, or did not recognize any of us at all. The sharp, capable man who had been the patriarch of our family was gone. Vivian had taken that from him along with everything else. Vivian was eventually convicted of financial fraud, elder abuse, and administering substances with intent to harm. She received a substantial prison sentence, though not as long as any of us thought she deserved. Her children Marcus and Serena were charged as accessories and received lesser sentences. The estate was partially recovered through legal processes that took years to complete, though much of what Granddad had owned was gone, spent by Vivian, or hidden in ways that could never be traced. The house was sold to pay outstanding debts. We received a fraction of what should have been our inheritance, enough to clear the legal fees we had accumulated, but not much more. But the money never mattered as much as the family. What Vivian stole that could never be recovered was time. Years of connection with my grandfather that we will never get back. Years of watching him disappear into a world controlled by someone who saw him only as a resource to be exploited. She stole his dignity, his independence, his sense of who he was. She stole the final chapters of his life, the years that should have been spent surrounded by people who loved him, enjoying his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, being honored and cared for as he deserved. Instead, those years were spent in confusion and isolation, controlled by a predator who saw his grief as an opportunity and his love as a weakness. Granddad died 18 months after Vivian's conviction. His decline was steady and sad, the dementia progressing in ways that made every visit both precious and painful. By the end, he did not know who any of us were. He called for Ellen constantly, calling for his first wife, the woman who had been his true partner for 50 years. We played recordings of her voice that we had found on old home videos. We showed him photos of their life together. We tried to give him comfort in the confused darkness of his final days. The last time I saw him conscious, he looked at me with sudden clarity and said, "I made a mistake, didn't I? I hurt people. I hurt my family." I told him it was not his fault, that he had been manipulated, that we all understood and forgave him. But he shook his head, tears running down his weathered face, and said, "I should have been stronger. I should have known. Ellen would never have let this happen. Ellen would have seen through her." He was right. Gran would have seen through Vivian in an instant. Gran would have protected him from his own loneliness and vulnerability. But Gran was gone. And in her absence, a predator had moved in and destroyed everything she had helped build. I stood at Granddad's funeral and gave a eulogy that focused on the man he had been before, the man who taught me to build things with my hands and believe in the goodness of people, the man who loved his family fiercely even when that love was exploited and manipulated in his final years. I did not mention Vivian by name. She did not deserve to be part of this day, but everyone who was there knew the unspoken context, knew the tragedy that had preceded this death, knew we were mourning not just a man, but the way his story had been stolen and corrupted at the end. Sophie stood beside me at the graveside, holding her daughter's hand. Lily was 8 years old now, old enough to understand some of what had happened, young enough to still believe that good could triumph over evil in the end. She asked why great-granddad Art had gone away for so long, and Sophie told her simply that a bad person had told him lies and made him confused, but that we had never stopped loving him, and he had never stopped loving us even when he could not remember how to show it. Lily accepted this explanation with the easy grace of childhood and placed a drawing she had made on the coffin before it was lowered into the ground. I visit the grave every month now, even years later. I tell Granddad about my life, about Sophie's children, about Dad's slow healing from the wounds that will never fully close. I tell him about the family we have rebuilt, smaller and sadder than before, but still connected, still loyal, still loving in the ways he taught us before everything went wrong. I tell him we forgive him, even though I am not sure he could fully forgive himself. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the cemetery is quiet, I talk to Gran too. I tell her we tried to protect him, that we failed, but not for lack of effort, that the man she loved was still in there somewhere even at the end. I tell her I understand now why she was so devoted to keeping the family together, why those Sunday dinners and shared holidays mattered so much, why she built connections so carefully and tended them so faithfully. Because without that foundation, without those bonds of love and trust, there is nothing to protect us from the people who would exploit our loneliness and grief for their own gain. There is nothing to catch us when we fall into the hands of someone who sees vulnerability as opportunity. My grandfather chose his new family over us, but I have come to understand that the choice was not really his. He was manipulated by a master of manipulation, controlled by someone who studied weakness and exploited it with surgical precision. The grandfather I knew, the man who loved us, would never have made those choices freely. He was stolen from us long before he died, taken piece by a woman who saw an elderly widower grieving his wife and recognized an opportunity to take everything he had. The legal system failed to protect him. We failed to protect him. And he, in his confusion and loneliness, failed to protect himself. But I refuse to let that be the end of the story. The end of the story is this: Vivian Cross is in prison. Her children lost their ill-gotten inheritance and their freedom. The truth came out, documented in court records that will follow them forever. And our family, though broken by what happened, is still a family. We are still connected. We still gather for dinners and holidays. We still tell stories about the people we have lost, including the grandfather who was lost to us before his body gave up the fight. We still choose love over bitterness, even when bitterness would be the easier path. I learned something from those terrible years, something I wish I had not needed to learn, but that I carry with me now like a scar that has finally healed. I learned that love alone is not enough. Love must be accompanied by vigilance, by boundaries, by the willingness to fight for the people you care about, even when the threat comes from inside the family rather than outside it. I learned that elderly people, especially those who are grieving and lonely, are vulnerable in ways that predators recognize and exploit. I learned that the legal system moves slowly and often fails, but that justice is still possible if you refuse to give up. And I learned that some losses cannot be recovered, some damage cannot be undone, but that you can still build something meaningful from the wreckage if you choose to. My grandfather is gone now, buried beside the wife who was his true partner, reunited in whatever comes after this life with the woman he never stopped loving even when he forgot how to say her name. The house where I learned to build birdhouses belongs to strangers now. The garden Ellen planted and Vivian destroyed has been rebuilt by people who never knew either of them. Time moves forward, and the wounds eventually become part of who you are rather than the entirety of what you feel. But I will never forget what was taken from us. I will never stop being angry at the woman who saw a lonely old man and decided to destroy him for profit. And I will never stop being grateful for the grandfather I knew before it all went wrong, for the lessons he taught me, for the love he gave me, for the foundation he helped build, even though someone else tried to tear it down. That is the story of how my grandfather chose his new family over us, except he did not choose. He was stolen, and we spent years trying to get him back, only to find that the man we were fighting for had already been erased by someone who never saw him as a person at all, only as a resource to be consumed. If there is a lesson in this tragedy, it is to protect the vulnerable people in your life, to watch for the signs of manipulation and control, to speak up when something feels wrong, even if you cannot prove it, because by the time you can prove it, it may already be too late. Granddad, wherever you are, I hope you found peace. I hope you found Ellen. I hope you understand that we never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. No matter what lies you were told about us, we fought for you, we lost, and we will carry you with us forever. Not as the confused, manipulated man of those final years, but as the grandfather who taught us what family was supposed to mean before someone came along and tried to destroy it. Rest now. You are finally home.